This is, as I think you probably all know, an ISSR event in honor of John Polkinghorne. I'm not going to say much about John because that's really up to our two main speakers and our panelists, except to say I think for probably all of us, John was somebody who was professionally and for most of us personally, a very good person to have known, and somebody who made to the discipline of the interface of science and religion an enormous contribution. I'm particularly grateful that it's ISSR that are doing this, to be honest, because he was our founding president. The society has been in existence for just over 20 years, and John was a very obvious person to be invited to take up the reins, which he kindly did. And for some of us, even though we knew he was getting less well, it's still difficult to really imagine the field without him, with his mixture of humor, perception, intelligence, and knowing everybody in the field. So without further ado, and I'm just speaking as Michael Rice as the current president, we've got two people who are going to have quite a substantive input. And Mark, over to you.
Thanks very much, Michael. Yeah, so it is a really great privilege to speak in honor of John Polkinghorne here. I should say right from the beginning, actually, that I never actually met him. I never really knew the man behind the legend, but he certainly has been a legend for as long as I can remember. I actually knew his son quite well. We were both students together at university, and his dad was already a legendary figure by then, and this was in the late 80s. So you're getting someone who, you know, the slight aura of awe that I've carried around with me, you know, from knowing him from a distance. So, of course, he made a very distinguished name for himself as a physicist, a theologian, and as a founding figure of the science and religion field. And most of us would be perfectly content with one of those, but John is significant in all three. So he really is, I think, you know, a rare being among mortals, was a rare being among mortals. Now, since I'm paired with Michael Velker today, who's a systematic theologian, or I know him as a systematic theologian, and my background is in physics, and some of my current work is in physics, I'm assuming that I'm representing the writings will realize that this is a bit of a joke on one of his best known works as it was published in the US. It's known as The Faith of a Physicist in the US. Okay, so I think to say from the outset, so one of the things most about John's writings has been his reflections on what it means to be a scientist as a human being, especially one who has experienced this kind of compulsion to turn to theology in order to make sense of the science, because that describes exactly my own journey into the science and religion field. And I noticed that there are many parallels between what's happened to me and what's happened to John. And I'll say a little bit more about those in a moment. Now, as I said, to my great regret, I never actually met John in person because I only really moved into the science and religion field in 2012, which was long after his retirement. He had largely wound down his writing and speaking activities by then, so I never got the opportunity to meet him, still less to sound him out on some of the lingering questions I have about his own perspective on physics. And, you know, I would have loved to have told him how central his work had been in my own formation as a scientist theologian. I've realized over the years that many of the thoughts I thought I've had have actually been Polkinghorne thoughts when I've turned to the text, but there you go. That's part of his legacy that we all deal with. Although I didn't really turn professionally into the science and religion field until 2012, I have been reading and thinking about it since the 1980s, and his books have always been my primary sources. Now, there's a great deal in those books that I instantly find familiar as a physicist myself, but I have to say there's also quite a lot in them that puzzles me. And to this day, I've never quite been able to connect with them. So I'll say a little bit about both of those things as I go along. Like John, I came to theology and the science and religion world from physics through ordination as an Anglican priest, and also a very formational and enjoyable time as an Oxbridge College chaplain, just as he did. I often used to be asked questions when I was a chaplain, like, are you going to be the next John Polkinghorne? which I always took to be a great compliment because I hadn't really done anything in the field at that point, and I still can't compare my own published output with his prodigious writings. But since John was a working physicist, and I am too, at least for some of the time, I tried to find a picture of me at work as a physicist, just to illustrate this bit of the talk. This was actually the only one I could find. Just in case you're not sure, I'm the one on the right. So this was taken in the experimental beam hall at the ISIS spallation neutron source in the Rutherford Appleton laboratory near Oxford. Now, you might wonder why I'm dressed as though I'm about to spend a day at the beach. The truth is that it would be searingly hot in the beam hall in summer, and this was the kind of practical thing that we used to wear. But looking at this now, I really think I should have at least had a shave, because I'm standing next to Bert Brockhaus, who was winner of the 1994 Nobel Prize in Physics for his work in inelastic neutron scattering, and I'm showing him what we had done with his technique in the UK. So I was 28 years old here. This is 1995, you know, quite a large part of a lifetime ago. Well, the following year, John Polkinghorne would retire from his position as president of Queen's College in Cambridge, and he entered a very fertile phase of his life in terms of his contributions to our field. But that's me at the age of 28. I also wanted to use this picture to underscore the point that what I'll be saying is a very personal reflection on John and his physics perspective, if you like, on the science and religion field, because I wanted to add that there is no such thing, I think, as the physics perspective. Now, despite the fact that John's work is often used as the kind of go-to in the science and religion field for questions about physics, I don't think that his work represents the definitive physics perspective in science and religion, and I doubt that he would have seen it that way himself. His own background as a particle theorist has had an immeasurable influence on our field, but the point I want to make here is that it could have been different if he had been another kind of physicist. Let me say a little bit about that and about physics. So, like any other natural science, physics covers a huge number of topics, methodologies, and disciplines. So, as I said, John was a particle theorist, and before he turned to science and religion, he made some important contributions to what we now call the standard model of particle physics, especially to quark-gluon structures in subatomic particles. And I've got this picture here, which is a beautifully concise illustration of what the standard model achieves, a description of, you know, the fundamental bits and pieces of the universe on a single page. And I think this is absolutely astonishing. Now, unlike John, I am an experimental condensed matter physicist. I work in an area that's about as far removed from John's as it's possible to be and still be in physics. In common with other condensed matter physicists, I'm interested in what we call many body systems, in complexity, self-organization, and emergence, the kind of things that happen in nature when you get many of these particles together. So, you know, I'm fascinated by the completely dizzying variety of materials that make up our visible world and all of their intricate properties. So to a physicist like me, particle physics is strangely austere and abstract. And in fact, I find it strange even to speak of such a thing as the standard model. For condensed matter physicists, we have many models, and few of them, probably none, are standard. In some ways, we're closer to chemists and material scientists, even some biologists, than we are to particle physicists. Most of us, though, do share with particle physicists the conviction that quantum mechanics is at the heart of most of what we do. But there's clearly a big difference in perspective between someone like me and someone like John. And that's not just because I'm an experimentalist and he was a theorist. So when I turn to his writings in science and religion, they come across to me as though they're absolutely imbued, shot through with the particle physicist's conviction that there is a singular truth at the heart of the world. We really are searching for the model, the theory of everything in a way. although John was often reluctant to speak of a theory of everything as such in his writings. But still, he would use the language of fundamental physics, that what he was studying was more basic in many ways than other scientific truths, perhaps even underpinning them all. Well, I have to say that I just don't see the natural world like that. And to me, oh, here we go. Nancy Cartwright's dappled world idea is much more the kind of thing that speaks to me about the science I do and the way that the relationships I have with other kinds of scientists. Now, this idea is enshrined in what we call the Stanford School or the disunity of science movement. This idea really speaks to me much more clearly of the world of nature that I know as a physicist and the sciences that I engage with, rather than some kind of abstract, austere, unified picture. And the way I understand it, each of us scientists works in our own little pool of shimmering light. Sometimes these pools merge and we make stunning connections, but for much of the time, we're surrounded by shadows. And all too often, we just don't know how to penetrate the shadows in any systematic way. So we get on with what we can see at hand. The fundamental physicists, though, so the particle physicists and the cosmologists, they seem to be much more bold than the rest of us. They tell us that their fields reach into the shadows, while the rest of us are really much more cautious or timid, at least, to claim anything about the shadows. So I've often wondered what our field of science and religion would have looked like if John had been another kind of physicist, a more dappled world kind of physicist like me, for instance, one who was ready to talk up complexity and organization and emergence over reduction, or one who was cautious about talk of what was most fundamental and universal in nature, or one who was keen to bring in other natural sciences into the picture as equal partners rather than talking about fundamental physics. Well, I digress. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that it's often seemed to me that the view of physics, which has taken as the standard view in science and religion, is actually John's view. It was astonishingly insightful and influential and fertile, but I would love to encourage scholars to push beyond that to new territory, new views of the physical world. A different aspect of John's background as a scientist, which seems to have been much less influential in the science and religion world, but which has always resonated with me, was his self-proclaimed identity as a bottom-up thinker. And those of you who know his works well will remember that he often starts his books with a short section on critical realism, and he'll often mention bottom-up thinking at the same time. Well, bottom-up thinking appears most prominently in his writings in his published Gifford Lectures from Edinburgh from 1994. And these were published in Britain as Science and Christian Belief, Theological Reflections of a Bottom-Up Thinker. And in the US, it was published as Faith of a Physicist, Reflections of a Bottom-Up Thinker. So this book uses the Nicene Creed as its framework. It's always seemed to me, actually, this is John's most valuable published contribution to the science and religion field, not least because it's one of the closest things we have to a kind of systematic theology of science and religion. If you look through it, it develops creation, anthropology, redemption, eschatology. You know, it does pretty much everything that a systematic theology ought to do. Of course, it's saturated with science and with John's particular view of physics, and rather characteristically of his writing, other sciences such as evolutionary biology are really pretty scarce, and most other sciences, in fact, beyond physics. But what interests me about this book, as is so clearly trumpeted by the subtitle, is the way that John uses this material to illustrate his identity as a bottom-up thinker. And I've got a quote here, which is how he explains this stance of being a bottom-up thinker. It is by seeking to start with the phenomena that give rise to the theories that I characterize myself as a bottom-up thinker. It's a natural stance for a scientist to adopt. We've learned so often in our exploration of the physical world that evident general principles are often neither so evident nor so general as one might at first have supposed. Many theologians are instinctively top-down thinkers. I don't deny a role for such ambitious intellectual effort. I'm merely wary of it and wish to temper its grand generality with the questionings that arise from the consideration of particularity. So I guess his point here is what we are familiar with. We might tend to call this empiricism, really, where we hold experience, sense data to the fore as our primary window on reality. So we move in our thinking from evidence-based reasoning to some kind of understanding, which might be revisable depending on the evidence available to us and our interpretation of it. Now, of course, John, in making this point about being a bottom-up thinker, it was pretty clear that he also did quite a lot of top-down thinking too. So I read him as having a kind of gentle evangelicalism, which is evident in the way he treats the Bible in this book, for instance. And I think that betrays a certain adherence to top-down principles, as does his view of the fundamentals of nature that I suggested earlier from particle physics. But it's the way that he develops his own view of creedal statements in the book. So he draws on a bit of science here, a bit of Bible there, and quite a liberal smattering of Moltmann throughout. I think that illustrates his kind of pragmatism, a kind of empiricism in a way, but at least a sort of provisional working Christianity. And I associate that with what he means by bottom-up thinking. And I have to admit that this is very much the way I do things too. I don't self-identify as an evangelical. I don't know if John did either, but I do have the same concern to build upon the data of experience and faith, including that of the Bible, which incidentally is why I spent a decade in orbit around biblical studies before I came to science and religion. So from my kind of broadly empiricist point of view, I've always found that John's writings instantly resonate with me in a way that professional theologians or professional theology often doesn't. I can see instantly where John is coming from, and I can quickly grasp where he's going. But in contrast, despite years of working with theologians, I still, all too often find myself lost, more often than I'd like, really, unable to grasp the starting point or the method, and really longing for some concrete data. So while John's identity as a bottom-up thinker doesn't seem to have caught on as a piece of terminology in our field, I do know precisely what he means. And I find the kind of pragmatism and empiricism that he's referring to instantly familiar and attractive from my background in physics. Now, by the same token, professional theologians can find John's approach really rather naive. And I'll share a quote with you now from Philip Hefner in a review of one of John's books called Confessions of a Scientist Theologian. This kind of general uneasiness that Hefner feels with John's readiness to speak of reality and truth. And Hefner says, while ordinary theologians cannot conceive that ontological truth would be accessible in forms other than metaphor, myth, and symbol, scientist theologians tend to be dissatisfied with anything less than relatively straightforward concepts that can claim truth. Although most theologians are likely to pay utmost respect to Polkinghorne's theories, they are unlikely to honor the kind of realist claims that he and other scientist theologians make for their theories. Pretty strong stuff, really, fighting talk, you might say. But I can see what he means, having spoken to a lot of theologians who have opinions about the science and religion world. I mean, I do agree with Hefner about the way that John reads the Bible. So to me, John does seem to be rather reluctant to engage with the complexities of biblical metaphor and myth and to get stuck into the biblical scholarship. But in general terms, I actually side with John. I think he's right to speak optimistically about reality and truth. And I think that John is right to keep pressing the issue on reality and truth against the cautions of someone like Philip Hefner. And John's search for clarity in theological language, I think, is helpful when metaphor can all too often be used as a rather fuzzy and imprecise refuge. So to give you an example of that, a sort of prime example of John's insistence on clarity in theological language, I really appreciate the way that he warns against the unguarded use of quantum mechanics as a source of mystery. And as a fellow physicist who uses quantum mechanics day in, day out, to the extent that its weirdness has become largely natural and intuitive to me, from that point of view, I share his discomfort when I see quantum theology or quantum mechanics being invoked as a source of magic and mystery in nature. John himself used to refer to this as quantum hype. Here's the last quotation I'm going to read for you. Quantum hype, he says, is the invocation of the peculiar character of quantum thinking as if that were sufficient license for lazy indulgence in playing with paradox in other disciplines. The strangeness encountered at different levels of reality have characters that are idiosyncratic to those levels, and no facile kind of direct transfer is possible between physics and theology. So if theologians like Philip Hefner can complain that John is too earnest or even perhaps too naive in his search for reality and truth, I think that John does, by the same token, warn against theological misuse of metaphors. Well, this is a whole nest of issues around bottom-up versus top-down thinking, around pragmatism, metaphor, truth, and so on and so on and so on. It's a perennial feature of our science and religion field, but not one that we've really dwelt on in the field for quite some time now. So I think now that the field is becoming more theologically mainstream, it might be time to return to this issue. So I'd be quite interested to hear what the respondents think about truth, metaphor, and so on. And I really just want to finish, so these are my last few sentences, really. I think that John was one of the very best communicators that we've ever had in science and religion. And that's saying something, you know, against the backdrop of many other excellent communicators in the field, seems to be one of our particular strengths as a scholarly guild. And I personally think that it was his commitment to looking for empirical starting points that really is the key to his success as a communicator, both in science and in theology. So it's no accident, I think, that many of John's books aren't really heavyweight academic tomes, so much as short and accessible presentations of how he found consonance between the sciences and his faith. John was a natural popularizer, another reason why he had such a massive influence on our otherwise very arcane interdisciplinary field of science and religion, where, you know, none of us is an expert. So quite simply, I think John could see more clearly than most of us, and he showed us the way.
Mark, that was tremendous. And by the way, immaculate timing. So thank you ever so much. Michael, if you're happy to, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for your kind invitation, and particularly thank you, Mark. I think we have many things in common. In our presentation, I knew John for many years, and I chose as the title John Polkinghorne, a dear academic, theological, and personal friend. In 1993, the Center of Theological Inquiry in Princeton, under the leadership of Dan Hardy, sponsored a 4-year consultation in which an interdisciplinary group of scholars, including the fields of cosmology, physics, biology, chemistry, environmental studies, philosophy, religious studies, and theology, moved from an exchange via different disciplinary and individual academic approaches to the dialogue between science and theology. This is where John Polkinghorne and I met and first became intellectual friends, and then in the course of several years, also personal friends. We developed many joint cooperations in international and interdisciplinary consultations and conferences, and did common publications in articles and books. John received the prestigious von Humboldt Research Award, and in this context came to Heidelberg for a number of extended visits. He invited me to Cambridge for a semester, and even once to the glorious Smith Feast before Christmas. For almost a quarter of a century, I felt blessed by our personal and academic friendship. In 2017, quite frail already, John contributed a 1-page text entitled Bottom-Up Thinking to the Festschrift for my 70th birthday. He kindly called me his oldest theological friend and succinctly described what brought us close. He writes, I soon felt a strong resonance with Michael in his way of approaching questions of truth. As a scientist, I'm not inclined to start with grand, self-evident general principles and then proceed to descend to the discussion of particulars. Too often these principles have turned out to be neither self-evident nor general. He termed his approach bottom-up thinking and added, I seek to approach theological issues in a like manner as does Michael. It seems a perfectly natural way to proceed in a religion of the incarnation in which the nature of God is believed to be revealed in the enacted history of the Word made flesh in Jesus Christ. The group in Princeton met annually for 4 years. In the second year, hoping for sound results by choosing a different approach, we decided to split into 2 camps in dealing with common questions and topics, namely into one part the top-down thinkers and the other the bottom-up thinkers. The participants chose their own group, and interestingly enough, each camp included scientists as well as theologians. I suppose it is not necessary to state expressly which side offered results after some hours of common work, while the other side continued discussions into the night without reaching shared results. Actually, after 4 years, we were not even ready for a joint book publication of the 2 groups. The journal Theology Today published 7 of the bottom-up texts on God, temporality, and evolution, with a perceptive introduction by Patrick Miller, Theology and Science in Conversation. Then Hardy's successor at the Center of Theologic Inquiry in Princeton, Wallace Alston, invited John and me to orchestrate a new multi-year research project. We selected the topic Science and Theology on Eschatology and invited a group of scholars, which even included biblical scholars of the Old and New Testament. This cooperation led to a very successful book with a fine title, The End of the World and the Ends of God, Science and Theology on Eschatology, published in 2000. Its 4 parts were first on eschatology in the natural sciences, subtitled Catastrophes and Hope. Second, on eschatology in the cultural sciences and ethics. Third, on eschatology in the biblical traditions. And fourth, on eschatology in theology and spirituality. Soon a 2nd edition came out, translations into Korean and Chinese followed. For a larger group of pastor theologians who discussed the results laid down in this book, John and I wrote 2 more methodological chapters. One was called Opening Windows onto Reality, and the other Springing Cultural Traps, the Science and Theology Discourse and the Common Good. In 2001, we published a book together with the title Faith in the Living God, a Dialogue. It came out in the US and in England, but also in Germany, in China, and after all these years has just been translated into Korean. In the chapter, The Search for Truth and Understanding in Science and Theology, we describe our methodological communalities. We regard our common approach as aiming at a critical and self-critical realism. We hold the conviction that faith is a ground for commitment and for questioning our commitments. Faith includes reliable knowledge and at the same time is an awareness of the limits of knowledge. The second point of similarity is that we both are wary of generalizing abstractions, and therefore we seek to anchor our thought in concrete particulars. We both agree in John's words that, I quote, experience and interpretation will always intertwine in hermeneutic circularity, but one should try to make the circles as tight and as small as possible. We are also in agreement that science as well as theology has to deal with the exploration of unseen realities. The statement with its reference to unseen realities does not mean that we have to give up bottom-up thinking and the claim to critical realism. Rather, it requires improvisatory approaches and an epistemological pragmatism. Above all, it requires a concentration on theological content and its connectedness to historical and even empirical evidence. I quote John again, "We both seek an understanding of God that is not absolute and abstract, but rooted in the rich experience of Israel and the church, and principally manifests neither in the starry heavens above, nor in the moral law within, but in the person of Jesus Christ crucified and risen. We therefore take the biblical witness of the Old and New Testament with the utmost seriousness, but do not commit to a fundamentalist sense of the inerrancy of Scripture." He continued the research on topics of eschatology with a strong concentration on the topic of the resurrection. With our California partners, Ted Peters and Robert Russell, he published the book Resurrection, Theological and Scientific Assessments in 2002. The question of eschatological credibility was crucial for us. It made a thorough investigation of the biblical resurrection accounts necessary. It became very clear that the resurrection of Christ is not a physical reanimation or resuscitation. Only when one isolates some verses in Luke 24, one gets stuck with the impression of a resuscitation. All the other accounts present us with a strange tension between palpability and appearance. Here, John's statement turned out to be helpful, namely that the biblical resurrection accounts speak, I quote him, speak of the continuity and the discontinuity between the pre-Easter Jesus and the post-Easter presence of Christ, continuity and discontinuity. The light appearances of the resurrected leave us with the open question of how these appearances could be connected to the pre-Easter Jesus. The stories of the empty tomb confront us with witnesses that the pre-Easter body was withdrawn. However, the stories of the empty tomb are connected with various statements that the empty tomb alone did not generate a belief in the resurrection. The third group of witnesses, dealing with encounters with the resurrected Jesus Christ, emphasizes the tension between palpability and appearance, the experience of a theophany, and doubt, multifarious doubts. In our research, the notion of a spiritual body became crucial for us. It questioned old-style dualisms of physical body and mental spirit. An affirmation of the cultural and historical objectivity of the transfigured body is needed, an objectivity that calls for the participation of the witnesses in the glorified life, a participation that transforms the lives of the witnesses. Later, we explored other eschatological symbol systems, such as the coming reign of God and the work of the divine spirit, in order to gain access to spiritual realities and to correct simplistic equations of creation with physical nature and cosmos alone. The wider view of creation also led to a fruitful set of new insights in the area of anthropology. Several consultations in Princeton dealt with this topic. They questioned all sorts of binary and dualistic concepts of personhood and asked for multidimensional perspectives on the human being. The most productive publication in this research was the book 2014, The Depth of the Human Person, a Multidisciplinary Approach. It involved physicists, biologists, psychologists, but also philosophers, theologians, historians, and law scholars from different countries. Many participants found St. Paul's highly differentiated anthropology most helpful. The material flesh, the partly material, partly spiritual body, the soul as a mental and bodily unity, the heart as a unity of cognitive, emotional, and voluntative activities, conscience as a polyphonic ensemble of voices in need of becoming a clear inner dialogue and orientation. And finally, the power of the human spirit in its ability to reach out far into the past and into the future and even to unseen realities. We brought the theology and science dialogue into contact with Pentecostal minds and forms of spirituality, but also with Russian Orthodox traditions of thought. Not easy projects. Many old ideas about the spirit as a simply numinous entity, or as a core of a totalitarian metaphysics, or as a just mentalist and intellectual power, had to be corrected. In all these cases, the dialogue between theology and science proved to be extremely helpful. A very difficult step was the inclusion of the areas of law into the dialogue. It started with a huge project, Concepts of Law in the Sciences, Legal Studies, and Theology, 2013. It turned out that it became necessary to question many aspects of the so-called natural law traditions. And John presented a very sophisticated notion of the laws of nature. In 2012, we conducted a big conference in Heidelberg under the title The Science and Religion Dialogue, Past and Future, published 2 years later. This conference celebrated the 100th anniversary of Sir John Templeton and 25 years of his foundation, which up to this day was one of the leading supporters of the science and religion or science and theology dialogue. John gave a powerful lecture on the topic, The Search for Truth. He argued that there is no universal rationality that fits all situations, but entities have to be thought about in the manner that conforms to their actual nature. He praised the power and the modesty of scientific approaches, asking what are the processes by which events occur in the physical world. And he added, addressing questions of meaning and value and purpose is deliberately bracketed out, but this by no means implies that these questions are not of the greatest significance. He therefore argued for a cousinly relation between science and theology. But he also warned against rather thin concepts of divinity, such as the great mathematician or the cosmic architect. He also acknowledged that many scientists are suspicious or even contemptuous of metaphysics, asserting that they have no need for such speculative activity. We both united, and I come to the end, we both united in that we had a strong reserve against the totalitarian metaphysics, but were in search of integrating general contact theories compatible with the consequent bottom-up thinking. Alfred North Whitehead spoke of a metaphysics as opposed to the usual the metaphysics, a metaphysics that arises when we ask how basic concepts in one area and one relative world of experience can be related to another area and relative world of experience. Whitehead stated that such a metaphysics can arise out of mathematized science, out of philosophical or religious thinking and theories, and even out of a sophisticated common sense. But each of these metaphysics has to be tested, whether it can serve as a fruitful contact theory between different areas of knowledge and whether it can develop sustainable truth claims. John described our common striving as follows. We are committed to the stance of critical realism, that is to say, to believe that the aim of inquiry is to attend an understanding conform to the way things actually are. That is why, for us, religious faith is primarily concerned with the reality of God. We encounter that reality as it is made known to us in the gracious gift of the divine presence, eliciting in its turn a human response. That response involves the whole person, going far beyond the mere assent of the intellect, although, of course, including that assent. For me, as a devoted academic theologian who wrestles with processes of self-secularization and self-banalization in my theological and ecclesial environments, this intellectual assent was crucial. John, however, with his wider view on spiritual realities, added, I quote him, for many Christians, the prime expression of their spiritual life is worship within the Eucharistic liturgy of the Church. Liturgy provides a common framework that both contains and enables the individual responses of the worshippers taking place within the common life of the gathered community of the faithful. It affords a pattern within the search for truth by the bottom-up thinker for by truth, by the bottom-up thinker can also find a place. Among my books, the one on the Holy Spirit and the one entitled What Happens in the Lord's Supper particularly appealed to John, very likely because of their practical orientations, included practical orientations. He himself, however, with his repeated plea for liturgy-assisted logics, proved to be the stronger practical theologian of the two of us. Even in this respect, I remain challenged and most grateful for his example. Thank you.
Well, that was great and absolutely complimented Mark. There's no magic order for the panelists, so I'll simply stick with the sort of order. Had Nicholas Saunders, possible.
Well, thank you very much, Mark and Michael, for the excellent talks. That was really fantastic. I knew John from my time back as a student studying physics and then theology at Cambridge, and he was one of my PhD examiners along with Arthur Peacock. So I remember quite daunting times going to pick John's brains after that, once he'd retired. He was always very generous with his time and his biscuits. And it was a great pleasure, and it reminded me a lot of hearing Michael Velko speak, because it reminded me also of one of John's slightly mischievous side as well, because in the late 1990s, John and I went to a conference in Germany, which Michael had organised, or was one of the speakers at, and John worked out at this conference that there was a way to trigger the red light on the top of other panelists' microphones so that he could effectively control who it was that looked like they were volunteering to answer questions. And the more difficult the question that came in, he would then choose who he wanted to answer it and volunteer them without them being able to control the fact that they were being volunteered. So it reminded me a lot of his, he did have that slightly mischievous and slightly sort of mercenary way of enjoying himself at academic conferences. So it's very good to remember that as well. So I suppose to pick up first with a couple of thoughts about Mark Harris's talk. It's very interesting to hear Mark talk about how he sees John's work on theoretical physics influencing his work. I mean, obviously, as Mark said, complex systems like experimental condensed matter are a long way from John's scientific work looking at the Standard Model and theoretical particle physics. But what I think is quite interesting is that John's approach to reductionism and emergence does seem to draw from both sides, and he was someone who was quite open to ideas of complexity and drawing down for downward emergence as well as it were upward emergence from a very, very reductionistic viewpoint. As Mark said, John was never a big fan of quantum hype or appeals to quantum indeterminacy as some sort of causal joint for the purposes of divine action. But he was also acutely aware of how little the different levels of explanation interrelate with each other. And he tended to kind of look at that as being either a difficulty in the way, an epistemological difficulty in the way that, because we have a lack of knowledge about how different levels of explanation might interface with each other, or more generally, he was quite open to the idea of it being an ontological difficulty or difference, much like the kind of Nancy Cartwright dappled law type approach. So I think he was quite open to the idea that theories have particular domains of application. So he was not someone who was a sort of bottom-up reductionist in that sense. And one of the points that John did used to make quite a lot is that if it's true that subatomic particles are not in some sense more real than cells or persons or other more complex systems, then they're not ontologically more fundamental than them either. And so he saw emergence as a two-way process. So you might both climb the ladder of complexity, but also you might, as it were, work your way down it. And there's no, on his analysis, there was no more sort of fundamental importance to being to entities that were described at that very bottom level than there were at the higher level. And I think that that's very much, when you look at his writing about chaos theory, that's very much the approach that kind of underpins some of that, because he makes the point that it is a simple and deterministic system at a very fundamental level, but the random and unpredictable nature of chaotic systems are something that he sees as being something where you can have a two-way traffic. And that is so some of the characteristics of the low-level description of the world and particle physics may be emergent as you move down, and the determinism may be something that is emergent as you move down, and so that isn't necessarily prescriptive for the whole of metaphysics. And so that's why I think a lot of his work on divine action and a lot of his work and his sort of emphasis on bottom-up thinking isn't quite so limited just to him being a kind of reductionist bottom-up thinker. He was far more open to that complexity and looking at complexity from both sides. Yes, I mean that was very much Mark and Michael. I think your talk was an absolute tour de force for the kinds of things that John's considered, and yes, I mean I really nothing but admiration for that as well, and thank you both very much.
So that was really appreciated. T'other Nicholas, do you want to come in now? You had the most distinctive writing relationship with John. So...
Well, no, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to this. I met John first, I think, in 1973, when I was an undergraduate studying mathematics at Trinity College, Cambridge. But the maths had a significant element of theoretical physics, and we were slightly precocious. So we went to lectures that were beyond our years as well as that were in our years. But John was also quite an active presence in the College Christian Union, and he just had such a lovely winning smile and such an engaging manner. So I was very much captivated by his personality, I think, both as a teacher. I had other amazing mathematical and scientific teachers, but also just as a shining personality. And then we slightly lost touch after I graduated, and then he became chairman of the Science, Technology and Medicine Board of the Church of England, and invited me to come and serve on it. And I started becoming his web presence. And we set up a polkinghorne.org site, of which the most interesting bit was that people would send us questions from all over the world on topics to do with science and religion. I would give a preliminary answer, or response, sorry, fax the question and the preliminary response to John, who never connected to the internet directly. And then he would add his comments, and we would then post these comments with all personal details removed on the website, so that there was a sort of spread of these things and other people might look at them. And then a publisher approached us some years later and about making a book from this. So we made a nice little book called Questions of Truth, which was 51 questions and responses on science and religion. And we had a big fight with the publisher. He wanted to call it Questions and Answers. And we said, absolutely not. These are responses. These are our thoughts about your question, but other responses are perfectly possible. And it gave us the opportunity not only to revise some of our responses a bit, but to write technical appendices. And we had three, one on astrophysics, one on neuroscience, and one on evolution. And we benefited from input from some real experts in these fields, because those are obviously fields that are a little bit rather beyond our direct competence. And I think I mentioned that partly because it was a lovely experience, and it is actually, I think, a very nice book. There's a hideous misprint in the middle, which we've never managed to get the publishers to correct. And we launched it at the AAAS meeting, and then we had a launch at the Royal Society with Honora O'Neill chairing, and this is a photograph from the panel. And I think it's fair to say that John, Mark, I see where you're coming from. And I think, if I may say so, your perspective is made a little harder, A, by not having known John personally, but also it's worth reflecting that John's experience of particle physics was, over the pretty early days. I mean, of course, he worked with Dirac. He wasn't quite in that generation. There's a lovely book of his called The Rochester Roundabout, which is about the early days of particle physics and how basically everyone was trying to figure out this stuff. we have a standard model now, but when John started particle physics, it was all completely unclear what was really going on. So I think it's fair to say that when he talks from his experience as a theoretical physicist in some of his, things like the Gifford lectures, I don't believe for one moment he ever thought physics is the only or the most fundamental piece of science, and everything comes up from particle physics. When he talks about being a bottom-up thinker, he absolutely does not mean you start from particle physics and you go up like that. He means, of course, that you start from observations and experience and data, and then you try and make sense of it, which was very much what was going on in the early days of theoretical physics, and of course what has to go on in all science. But he was intellectually completely clear, and perhaps the fact that we wrote these 3 appendices make it clear that there are many other really important scientific fields, that they're clearly all at some level aspects of one bigger and wider reality and truth, but one which we can only access partially. So I think I can defend him quite strongly. I won't go any further against, charges of either reductionism or of sort of, how shall I say, sort of philosophical and scientific imperialism. He was just talking about the aspect of science that he knew best. And, it was lovely to collaborate with him. We didn't write any other books. I'm not a professional academic. I have a sort of day job that involves advising big companies. But I think that his sort of wideness and wisdom, and as Nicholas said, the mischievous twinkle in his eye are a really important corrective to the idea that one might get from the books. And there's some of that in the books of him being slightly sort of, I know you didn't say intellectual imperialist, and I'm not accusing you of having said so, but just for the sake of clarity, he was very much the opposite of those people who imagine that their discipline is the only discipline that's really important, which is a curious thing. Biologists, economists, physicists, everybody seems to think their discipline is the only really important one, and the others don't matter if you push them too hard. And I'm sure John never thought that about his discipline or anyone else's.
Nicholas, thank you very much indeed. And you may win the prize among those of us present for the person who knew John the longest. Fraser, you knew him for quite a good chunk of time. Let's have Bethany first, and then we'll come to you last, Fraser. So, Bethany.
I had the privilege to meet John on a couple of occasions, usually as a result of the work of the Faraday Institute. And so I remember my very first time coming to England as a master's student, coming to one of the week-long workshops that the Faraday Institute was putting on. And it was absolutely amazing to sort of just be amongst so many eminent theologians, philosophers, scientists. And Mark, you mentioned his grand communication skills. And my recollection was that when it came time for his lecture, he simply walked up, no notes, and spoke fluently for an hour without pause, without stumble. And introduced me, who was brand new to science and religion at the time, to wonders like the mystery of the boiling kettle, whether it's, a result of electrons running through, or whether it's simply, I want tea, and these different levels. And he was just so wonderful at creating pictures that sat in your mind for years afterwards, in my case, as someone who in just a few words could open up whole new sort of vistas of exploration. Mark, you'd asked us to think a little bit about truth and metaphor in his work, and I don't remember him identifying himself as evangelical, but I do remember him identifying himself as an open theist. And I sort of think of how consistent that is with sort of a bottom-up view. So where process theism begins with philosophical ideas, and even classical theism, you could think, starts with philosophical propositions about God that are then worked out. Open theism, at least in the adherents' own articulation of their views, starts with saying, well, God seems to change God's mind in the Bible a lot, and there seems to be God answering prayer in our experience and in our readings of Scripture. And so working from there up to a vision of God is really consistent with that sort of bottom up approach that we see. And even I was thinking of, one of the big influences of John's work on mine was really through his introduction of sort of the free process idea, which he works out in books like The Work of Love, and the sense that all agents, not quite in the process theist way, but in, all living agents have certain freedoms of action, but also non-living agents have freedom of process. And again, that's just a different way of saying that the world is built from the bottom up, in a different way than we might think of somebody like Arthur Peacock, who thinks of divine action working through top-down constraint in rough ways. And so I think that there is that sort of just really consistent, his own representation of how he did theology seems to work out when you think about how he worked out his various philosophical and theological approaches. I appreciated how much of a pioneer he was, and you often see in some of his books, he's really pioneering methods in science and religion that the rest of us have all benefited from. And I think one of his books that to me was the most sort of bold and inventive in that was his book on quantum physics and theology, A Strange Kinship. And he really tries to sort of take things like wave particle duality and compare them to the hypostatic union of Christ. And we might want to quibble with some of how he worked those out, but I think in terms of somebody who really struck out to try and create new knowledge, you see this over and over again. And Mark and I were talking yesterday about how many of the ideas that we work with, we go back to Polkinghorne's books and find, oh yeah, even if not fully developed, there's some seed of that sort of thing already in his writing. And my last sort of sense was really just the joy of his being. The twinkling eye, the broad smile have already been mentioned, but another one of those sort of enduring moments in my mind was when he and Ernan McMullen at one of these Faraday events got up in a Q&A session afterwards and had a very warm but convivial disagreement with each other over the nature of open theism and classical theism and their respective merits. And so I think as someone who just demonstrated wonderful, gracious disagreement on these sort of ultimate issues we all seek after, he really paved a path that we can all hope to emulate.
Beautifully put, Bethany. Thank you very, very much indeed. And as I indicated, rather than allowing anybody to respond, Fraser, straight over to you, and then we'll begin to open up.
Thanks very much. I think I can represent the Cambridge context of John's life. I mean, I knew him in faculty and college in Cambridge. I think my first encounter with John was at the selection interviews when I had applied to be the Starbridge lecturer in theology and natural science, which was a pretty intimidating way to have my first encounter with him. But though I didn't know this at the time, I actually had it fairly easily because John had a very strong view that the first person appointed to that lectureship, if it was to have any credibility, must be someone who has had some actual background in science. And I realized later that I was up against 3 historians, and the history of science was what John least wanted to have appointed to that post. So I think if I'd put up at all a tolerable performance, I would have got John's vote. I think I had it easy with some of the other key people. Mary Hesse was there as the other assessor, and half of my first degree in Oxford had been in philosophy, so I was able to have a go at talking philosophy with Mary Hesse. And then there was Nicholas Lash. I mean, those who remember Nicholas Lash know that he was enormously opinionated about everything, and thought that most theologians talk nonsense except him or very few others. And he thought the best remedy for talking theological nonsense was to have been taught by him. And I had been taught by him for 1 term, and I think that was enough for him to believe that he'd knocked the worst stupidity out of me on the theological front. But it was a fairly intimidating way of getting to know John. And then unexpectedly, I became Director of Studies in Theology at Queen's, where John became president, which was a great opportunity to get to know him. Brian Hebblethwaite had been the Director of Studies, continued in his faculty position, but for various reasons chose to withdraw from his college responsibilities. And John and I very often had coffee together after lunch in college, and that was a lovely opportunity to get to know him. And I probably had the opportunity of listening to John's frank opinions about people more than most people have, which was very interesting. And I think there was always a kind of tension in John between his enormous kindness to people, which was unmistakable, but also his impatience with many of his fellow human beings. And that came out in his remarks. I mean, there was one particular theologian who I won't name, who he felt lacked the clarity of mind that he admired, and he complained about whenever this person started speaking in a conference, a sense of fog descended over the whole conversation, and John found that exasperating, and he expressed his views about that quite clearly. And it was always interesting as well talking about Stephen Hawking, who I think John has supervised for his PhD. And remarks about Stephen Hawking would usually begin rather grandly with John saying, "The trouble with Stephen is." And I don't think there's anyone else who could begin remarks about Stephen Hawking in quite that way. So I was, I had the privilege of getting to know some of John's often private thoughts about other people in the field. I was always struck by the enormous clarity of his thought. When I was first appointed to the Starbridge lectureship, I was sort of reading myself into the field. I hadn't really done much in science or religion. Astonishing that I was appointed to that post without much background in it, apart from one book on psychology and religion. And so I read John's books as one of the sort of primers. And I started trying to make notes on them. And I found they almost defy making notes because they are so beautifully clear and concise in themselves. You can't sort of weed out the padding and just sort of note down the key points because they're pared down to the bone anyway. They're very readable, but there's no padding at all. It's quite an interesting writing style. And I wonder whether John's distinctive writing style arises in some ways from his having made his career writing equations. I mean, there is a translucent clarity about John's prose style that in some ways reminds me of the translucent clarity of Benjamin Britten's musical scores. I mean, there is something, there's nothing opaque there. I mean, John always knew exactly what he was thinking and expressed it clearly and could do so at the drop of a hat. And I remember one occasion when John and I were interviewing someone for a research fellowship in science and religion, and John asked him what he thought the role of metaphysics was in the relationship between science and religion. And the candidate unwisely threw out his hands and said, "What is metaphysics?" And John, without pausing for a second, came back with a crisp and concise definition of metaphysics. And I think it was the speed of the draw which was particularly impressive. Not a second thought before he delivered this crisp definition of what metaphysics was. So I have a lot of fond memories of John. He was enormously helpful to me in my career, and I'm hugely grateful for that. One comment I think make about his work in science and religion, I agree with him about almost everything, but two areas where I think his writing is not what it might be, and one is on fine-tuning, where I think he moves too easily from the facts of fine-tuning to a theological interpretation. And I was always somewhat uneasy about that. And the other is about chaos theory. And there I don't have unease in what he said, but I'm puzzled that he never really explained his thinking on chaos theory very clearly. I mean, he writes a huge number of books about all sorts of things, and chaos theory, I think, is some of the most original thinking he does in science and religion, some of the toughest thinking he does in science and religion, but he never really explains it very clearly for the general public. And Nicola Saunders, who was speaking a while ago, I think explains what John actually thought about chaos theory much more clearly than John ever did himself. And that's a strange puzzle about his work. But he was enormously influential. And one of the people I invited to be a part of this conversation was David Ford, who was Regius Professor in Cambridge for much of John's time. And he's not able to be here as on a lecture tour in America. But I think if he had, the thing he would have wanted to pay tribute to most of all is John's remarkable work, as he put it once in conversation, in touring the world, reassuring people that despite science, you could credibly be a Christian. And I think John was enormously influential in that. And Christians in many countries owe John a huge debt of gratitude for that.
Well, I feel very grateful to our two speakers and all four panelists, each of whom have given wonderful, wonderful contributions. Now, we're in a slightly unusual situation, everybody. The absolute latest at which we will finish is 45 minutes from now. If we naturally draw to a conclusion before then, that's fine. But there is now no substantive structure. You know, think of this a bit like at the end of a dinner party or something like that. And I'm very content for people either electronically to raise a hand, or those of you who've got your cameras on to raise it in actuality. And people might want, thank you, Bob, I'll come to you in a second, people might want to make personal reminiscences, as quite a bit of what Fraser said was about that, or they might want to make professional or academic points, or they might want to ask a question or respond in some other way through making a comment to what they've already heard. That's absolutely fine. So, Bob, I hope you were about to want to contribute something, because I'll take you, therefore, as the first person. Bob.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for all those thoughts that people have shared today, which just show the many faceted nature of John from many perspectives. And I recognise many of those from knowing him quite well. There's just two things I wanted to say. One, to reinforce what Bethany said. I shared a platform with John quite often. And one particular talk, I was introducing him, and he had his notes in his hand. Literally, it was on the back of an old envelope. And literally, it was 3 words. And then he spoke for an hour. I think he was brilliant. At that, very clear thinking. The other thing that was very characteristic of him, which I don't think anybody has mentioned, was I listened to so many of his talks that I began to recognize this. he would often talk about the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. I don't know if people noticed that, but he used to say it as if it was one word: life, death and resurrection. He said it so often, unhyphenated, just one word. And that was very characteristic of him, and it actually showed his core Christian belief right there in that one phrase, it sounded like. And I really appreciated that. He'd been talking about some complicated scientific thing, and then he said, but of course the important thing is the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. So that's just my ha'porth of contribution. Thank you.
Bob, thank you so much. And various people are putting good comments in the chat. You don't have to say them out loud, but some of you might wish to have a chance to elaborate on them orally.
While people are waiting, could I just mention something I forgot to say in the talk? When we did those technical appendices, we stuck our necks out on a couple of scientific topics. We were quite skeptical about cosmic inflation. I mean, we didn't say it definitely wasn't happening. We just thought, if there is inflation, there should be inflatons. There isn't very much convincing evidence for this. We're not entirely sure that this is necessarily the whole story. And we were really quite skeptical about string/M theory. In retrospect, I think those were quite bold calls for 2009, when both of those ideas were very much reigning in physics. I suppose M theory was beginning to crack. Lee Smolin had written The Trouble with Physics. And I'm really rather relieved I think it's fair to say that in 2022, it's by no means obvious that we got that wrong. Certainly, as far as to my knowledge, there's been no convincing confirmation of, that the missing pieces of inflation don't seem to have turned up. And people are much less convinced that string/M theory is the only right way of looking at the universe. So in my case, it was probably dumb luck. But I think one of the things John had, if you've been around particle physics for a long time, you kind of knew when things smelt right. And he wasn't convinced that those quite smelt right. And we'll see.
Mark.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, it's just I suppose I feel I'd like to come back at Nicholas Saunders and Nicholas Beale, because I really do feel that physics is being a little bit misrepresented here. I've read, John's work, and he does mention complexity, emergence, and chaos theory, of course, in great length. But it really is, the weight of his material really does come down on an area of physics that is not mine. And I think when you read John's work from another area of physics, he sounds like he is a particle physicist. And in particular, I found that over the years, I've absorbed a lot of what he's said, to the extent that I find it difficult to disentangle what's Polkinghorne and what's Harris. But he never gave me the tools to help me interpret my own kind of physics. And I think that's why I slowly developed this conviction that, well, how would our field have looked if John had been a different kind of physicist? And I think that's the question I want. Forget reductionism, forget emergence, forget all these kinds of things. I'm interested here, or the question I was raising was, what kind of field would it have looked like if he'd been different? What are the kinds of things we could do now, for instance, building on the legacy that he gave us, moving into other areas? So that was what I was trying, the kind of boat I was trying to float, really. So and particularly, I really do want to insist, I suppose, that he doesn't give us physics, he gives us a particular view of physics.
Yeah, I'm sure he'd have agreed that his perspective in physics is only one. I mean, of course, as you will know, at Cambridge at the time there was a department of pure mathematics and theoretical physics, where he was, and then there was the Cavendish, which was experimentalists, and in some cases they talked to CERN but not to each other. So I'm sure he would be the first to admit that his particular professional experience was just one strand in a very large, one strand in a very large field of physics, which was itself a very large subset of natural sciences. Again, something probably Cambridge gets right, to have a natural sciences tripos. And I think it's fair to say he's speaking from his own background, but I don't think he ever thought that meant it was the only valid perspective. And I agree, it would be one. Look, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a John Polkinghorne, if there were several John Polkinghornes from several different fields? I mean, we'd be immensely blessed. And I agree, we mustn't. And I don't think he would ever have wanted our perspective on science and religion to be limited to the perspective of a theoretical particle physicist. I mean, he wasn't even an experimental particle physicist, but everyone is who they are.
And I hope I'm allowed to say, because Fraser, in his account of the interview, which I hadn't heard before, so thank you for saying it. And I don't know whether to feel more sorry for you or for Nicholas Saunders in terms of the circumstances under which both of you had early meetings with John, in terms of being examined for a job interview, or examined for a doctorate, or interviewed for a job interview. But as you said, he probably wasn't somebody who loved the idea of historians of science being seen as representative of science. And those of you who are physicists can contradict me if you want to, but in common, I think, with a lot of top scientists, he would see the social sciences as a more modest set of accomplishments. And now that we're getting more people working in science, religion, the obvious fields being we're getting more people in these with strengths in ecology, and yourself, Mark, in earth science, and many people in evolutionary biology, it is broadening the field, which in those early days, 40 years ago, when he really was one of the founding fathers, inevitably could not be the case. And I think you're right, Mark. There are, sort of founder effects. The individual that colonizes the island has a particular set of consequences for the future of life on that island, which ironically only a good historian can subsequently probably begin to decipher. And can I pick up one thing that Fraser said? Because I was thinking the same thing you mentioned clarity so often, Fraser, and other people had said the same thing, this extraordinary ability to not only write, which, many of us eventually can get writing that's reasonably clear, but just to speak beautifully, often without notes. But he did have very firm views about certain things. And I remember when I was training for ordination, so it's about 33 or 5 years ago, John, typically of him, generously giving over a chunk of a Saturday to come and teach us superbly. But when he was asked about the anthropic principle, he had no sympathy for those people on the course who were beginning and struggling to articulate a view that was different from the one he held. He genuinely thought that alternative perspectives were wrong. And as you say, he saw a particular set of inferences following from so-called fine-tuning and believed that others were mistaken, and was quite happy to tell loads of people who were young ordinands what was right.
Thanks very much indeed, Michael. It was that mention of young ordinands that prompts me to come in, because I've very much appreciated the many personal reflections that people have shared tonight about John. And my own encounter with him was in precisely that context of being a young ordinand who pitched up in Cambridge, fresh from taking a doctorate in chemistry, in fact, and by chance found himself affiliated to Queen's College at precisely the moment when John went there to be president, leading to having one-to-one tuition with him for a course in science and theology that was being taught in Cambridge at that time for the Tripos. And I think a number of people have already said things along the same lines as this, but what I always remember is the tremendous support that I had from John as a student, and subsequently, not only that one-to-one tuition, but I can remember him lending me the proofs of his next book to read between tutorials, which was Reason and Reality, in fact, before it had actually been published. I still have the little notes that he sent me, just before I took Tripos, to wish me good fortune in all that and what have you. And I'll never forget also, when I was subsequently a curate in the wild wastes of High Wycombe, arranging a series of talks by folks who came out to address the congregations of that town. And John duly came out to deepest Buckinghamshire and contributed to that contributed to that series of talks. Again, a wonderfully supportive thing to do for one of his ex-students. So thank you everybody for your various reflections on John. I have very, very fond memories of him, and it's been very good to hear those this evening. Thank you.
Can you remember, Mike, which year you would have attended his Tripos lectures?
Yeah, it would have been, I took the Tripos in 91. So it would have been in the academic year 1991.
I was taking the liberty of asking because I think if you'd been, I can't work it out exactly, but if you'd been possibly only 1 year or 2 years younger, some people may remember John was suddenly taken quite ill. And rather to my surprise, I was the person asked by John to give those lectures for the term or 2 terms. I can't remember, which might be a sign of just how ill he was, that I was the only name he could dredge up. But thankfully, unlike the habit several of you've mentioned of the 3 words on the back of an envelope, thankfully, his lecture notes were written out in great detail. So not very surprisingly, I used them verbatim when talking about physics. And it was only after a term, or I can't remember now if it was 2 terms, towards the end, when they began to be a bit thinner on biology, which is my own subject, that I felt brave enough to begin to start departing from them. But I do remember the beautiful clarity of his work in his physics lecture notes, exactly.
It's a fairly small point and a response to your comment about the broadening of the field. And I think science and religion did start by being work on the interface of physics and Christian theology, and the sciences have broadened out. But I think John was entirely supportive of appointing myself as a psychologist to the first Starbridge lectureship in theology and science. In fact, I've always thought it was to my advantage that I wasn't a physicist. I think he probably thought that a physicist wouldn't be able to add anything to what he'd already done, really, on the interface between physics and theology, whereas he was keen for the field to broaden out. He wanted a working scientist, but he was very happy for it to be someone working in a different field of science from where he was himself. Very supportive of that. Nicely put, nicely put.
Can I tell one more anecdote? I've told Fraser this in the past, but I can't remember if I've told any others of you. When John was, it fits in with the point mentioned about a sort of evangelical strand to his personal understanding of Christianity. But his first curate post, it might have even been technically, yes, I think it was before he was a curate, sorry. It was when he was still training for ordination. So we're talking either very late 70s or possibly 80 or 81. But he was assigned to Holy Trinity in Cambridge, which at that point was the church of which I worshipped. And I remember very well that his sermons were wonderful because, again, they were beautifully clear, but he was very happy to ask questions, actually. And one of the questions I remember him raising in one of his sermons was about the possibility of the existence of purgatory. And I don't know whether it was in his sermon notes or whether it was simply ad-libbing, but in the sermon, I can absolutely assure you, he got quite keen on the idea of purgatory for the very standard, reasons of roughly speaking, solving the issue of roughly speaking, how can any of us hope to enjoy the life that we might live in the world to come, despite all our imperfections in this life, even though he obviously was utterly on top of conventional understandings of what Christ did for us in his death. Anyway, he was promptly taken off the preaching rota. The then vicar wasn't going to have this sort of dangerous thinking allowed in sermons. And definitely wanted people to stick to a slightly more conventional understanding of Protestantism. Nicholas.
One of the things which I think, Michael, you develop very much more in your books with him, which I confess I haven't read them all, is I remember his remark that theologians seem to have given up on, the length of time of the universe. 1,000 ages at thy sight is like an evening gone was a well-known fact for the time of Psalm 90, and yet, you know, so many contemporary theologians seem to think that, you know, 100 years is a long time ago. And I was preaching the other day and was able to just, you know, use this, perhaps the fairly standard analogy that if the universe were a person coming up to their 70th birthday, then, you know, Jesus was born about 5 minutes ago. And we just tend to lose sight of that in so much of our life. And I think John made that point in a number of occasions quite forcefully. And it's something that science could give back to theology, which is to remind theology what it's really about. I'm sure you could say, Michael, you could say a lot more about it than that.
Nicholas, that was great. Michael, it's up to you. Would you like to?
John was very happy when I argued that Genesis 1 talks about 2 time systems, so that the 7 days of the Lord are not the days under the sky, the earthly days. And I congratulated me in a way and said, Michael, this was a freeing insight, that we have to wrestle with 2 time systems. And of course, the old days didn't know about 30 billions of years. The greatest number they were able to capture was probably 10,000 times 10,000, the heavenly host. But they knew that these were immense amounts of time. These 7 days of the genesis of the cosmos and the powers, not only of the cosmos, but also of the world unseen. So the creeds speak of the creation of visible and invisible things. And invisible things is not just the cosmos. And John was also very happy when I argued the resurrection is a reality, like mathematics for the sciences. Yeah. And so he was very open for these complicated analogies that can be discovered when you go a little bit more thoroughly into the depth of spiritual and biblical insights. And here we had, very intensive and engaging discussions, and also this joy of discovery, so that you do not only have the joy of discovery in the sciences, but also in scripture-oriented theology. And he also liked this insight that Israel had to live under global powers. That is, it developed its own sophisticated law, interplay between justice, care for the weak, and liturgical and cultic dimensions under the pressure of Egypt, Assur, Babel, the Persian, the Greek, the Romans. So many, many global powers which forced the evolution of the biblical canon and generated all sorts of insights. Some of them were helpful for some time. The great discovery of the covenant, legally and politically strong, economically strong, but theologically highly complicated. And so the priestly writings have to correct Deuteronomy and so. And John took a great joy in these kind of grand evolutions and grand discoveries. So we were, in many, many very good historical, biblical, exegetical discourses, and it was a joy to see his joy when you got a new clue. Oh, this is this kind of transition of worldview that happened under these and these conditions. And he liked to quote his colleague, "My cosmological friends were often in error and never in doubt." But this is what we have in theology. Exactly, throughout the history and up to contemporary situations. And we had this cousinly relation also in mocking sometimes over these stubbornness of not being in doubt. But having to confess an error just 5 or 10 or 15 years ago.
That was great, Michael. Thank you very much indeed. Fraser.
Yes, he had strong instincts about where the truth lay in physics, I think, and someone referred to that. Another example of that was in quantum physics, where he was very distrustful of David Bohm. I mean, he recognized that the theory made the right predictions, but it just didn't smell right for him. He thought it was too contrived and very unlikely to be right. And another interesting case, and I don't think people have referred to this, and I'm not sure that John wrote very much about it, is about time. I mean, he was very skeptical about the block universe idea. Yeah. And thought that the common sense idea was that there was linear time and that flowed from the past into the future. And he thought if you had a scientific theory that was disagreeing with that, then the scientific theory was probably wrong. And he was quite firm in his views about that, as he was about a number of things. I don't know if any of the physicists here have anything to say about his views on time.
He was very keen on the eschatological topic of the parousia, yeah, which is not a re-entry, yes, of Christ. But the parousia talks not about linear time. You have twice in the biblical canon, if people say, here is the Messiah or there, do not believe. And if they say, this end time catastrophe will happen there or at this time, do not believe. Because what the parousia is all about is the entering in all space-time points, not in one on a linear scale. And these were discourses in which John greatly rejoiced. Yeah? When you could correct scientific commonsensical coalitions that got us into traps in one-way streets, and could show that these traditions seem to be off the cloud, but that they encountered a more complex reality. Also, the fullness of a life of the person. Yeah? He quoted very often one remark, when you sit at the deathbed of a beloved person, and you see this nearing death, and you think, who is this person? Was it the child on the yellowish photographs, or the shadow that threw me into the air when I was a little kid, or the person with whom I had long conversations over the years, or now, this death-bound face? And you have to say all of this and much, much more, because our physical existence on this earth is only a fragment of our whole existence. And these were the conversations in which we both rejoiced and tried to inspire each other by deeper insights into reality. Although we are talking about reality unseen. So, yeah, so some of these sparkles of our conversations and our exchanges over the years, and it was most helpful to have the clarifying mind of a well-trained scientist in these conversations, so that you got a warning when you were tempted to move into wishful thinking, and on the other hand, you got a warm smile when you had the feeling, well, at least we are approaching the path of truth.
Yes, it was simply to say a bit more about relativity, block time, and quantum mechanics and things like that from the physics perspective. So I find John fascinating on both of these topics, actually. So I was really glad that Michael developed in his talk John's eschatology and what he takes from the resurrection of Jesus, which I think is really his big theological innovation, which the rest of us in the science theology world have largely or at least the Christian version of it, have largely taken as this is our consensus as well, really. And much of what I read in this area is very much Polkinghorne with a few modifications. So I think he's a very, very important figure there. It's interesting, though, that when he talks about relativity and time, he is excellent at explaining it in very, very accessible terms. But it is odd that he always takes, with time anyway, the kind of common sense flowing time view. Whereas when you come to quantum mechanics, which I think is an even stronger strength, if you see what I mean. I mean, he wrote some really excellent popular level books on quantum theory, like the Oxford Very Short Introduction. He's really excellent on that. But he's quite happy to dwell on the strangeness of quantum mechanics, and he doesn't try to explain it too much. What I find interesting, though, maybe this is in common with his rather pragmatic, common sense attitude to relativity. He doesn't really like discussing the metaphysics very much of quantum mechanics. And so when you look at his books from the perspective of modern quantum foundations, for instance, which is so Bohmian or else Everettian, he doesn't have any time really for those sorts of interpretations. He sticks very much with the kind of Copenhagen orthodoxy, if you like, which makes him sound quite old-fashioned, but his books are really excellent introductions to quantum theory.
Yeah,
Oh,
I wanted
great.
to sort of build on that and just think about, we're seeing some tensions where often he was extremely open-minded towards what would seem like difficult things to hold in tension that are not common sense. And yet other places he really wanted to work with the common sense. And I wondered if, in relation to time, that had to do with his theological commitments. So open theism just really doesn't work well if you have a block universe. You know, it's much harder for God to both respond and answer prayers in the way that he thought if you have, again, a block universe. And so I wonder if that's one place where we're seeing the theology really sort of determine the physics. And there was, another sort of thought in my mind was this sort of epistemology models ontology, and whether that's another sort of small departure from his usual sort of bottom-up thinking in terms of these things.
Anybody else like to ask a question or make a contribution?
I was just going to say, I think John was quite open to the idea of theology and physics in dialogue with each other, in the sense that you could also, if you take the example that Mark was giving of looking at the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, I mean, John had quite strong views that some of those were theologically unacceptable. He didn't like the idea of a kind of many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, where people were living in sort of perfectly good and perfectly awful worlds, and the idea of a God maintaining all of these simultaneously seemed to him to be rather unsatisfactory. I mean, he also had pretty strong views about the science as well, as you can imagine. But he did express quite strong views about a lot of physicists that he had come across, some including some very well-known physicists. He wasn't much of a fan of Feynman, as I recall, but he did, he was very open to this idea of theology and science both being different types of models for describing the universe. And I think part of his background in particularly doing particle physics was the fact that he was very concerned about ideas of God of the gaps and the fact that scientific revolutions come along, and that influenced a lot of his thinking in the way that he approached, looking at sort of epistemology, models, ontology, and all of these sorts of these kinds of approaches, because he didn't want to tie himself down to some particular causal nexus or some other sort of thing that could then be replaced by some scientific advance, because he'd seen that time and time again in particle physics, I think, throughout his career. And that really led him to a much more open approach, where it didn't mean he didn't have strong opinions about things. He certainly did, sometimes slightly unpredictable opinions about things. I mean, I remember having an argument with him about, there was a paper by Eugene Wigner where he wrote about the sort of unreasonable ability of mathematics to model, I can't remember the name of the paper, but why is it that mathematics models the universe so well, and John was quite forceful about, you know, in his dislike of some aspects of that. And whereas actually that seemed to me to be the kind of natural corollary from a lot of his work, in a way. You know, he liked to kind of draw insight from the way that science modeled things. So he's quite a complex character, actually, taking those kinds of different thoughts and kind of piecing them together, and his influences, as Mark was saying, and Michael was saying, you know, he wanted to bring theology together to create this kind of quite an unusual kind of homogeneous view of the world that was both influenced by science and theology, which, you know, is quite a difficult thing to combine in that way.
Nicholas, thank you. Fraser.
A brief comment about his ability to make great phrases, and science and religion he often talked about in terms of binocular vision. His talks often ended with that if science and religion provide two perspectives on things, and he would say we see better with two eyes than with one. And my favorite, I think, was about quantum physics releasing us from the tyranny of common sense. I think that was a great phrase, and part of John's contribution, I think, to science and religion was to release us from the tyranny of common sense.
And in that case, from those of us who have made more comments, anybody else want to make any final remarks or raise another issue?
Just one remark of about an example of John's genius ability to get us out of traps of understanding. I became very much fascinated by the multimodal working of the Spirit. You know, the pouring of the Spirit on male and female, old and young, master and slaves, different nations, and so on, challenging mono-hierarchical, patriarchal, gerontocratic, slaveholder society, chauvinistic societies that still exist in our environments. But then we said, if the Spirit works in this way, how can we speak of the personality of the Spirit? Don't we need the trap of commonsensical, personalistic modes, self-referential, and so on? And John, after a lot of thinking, said, Michael, we don't need the self-referentiality. The Spirit is context sensitive. This was a genius insight. Yeah? The personhood of the Spirit, don't look at the standard anthropomorphic self-referential activities. No, it's the context sensitivity that constitutes the notion of the personhood of the Spirit. And then you get a much more elaborated notion of personhood, and so on and so on. So these were insights that exploded standard common sense thinking and brought us on new levels of search for truth and insight. And here John was brilliant. So these are insights that are, yeah, we speak of Bildungserlebnisse, yeah? And Bildungserlebnis, it's not just an insight or good idea or so. No, it shapes your whole modes of thought and imagining and opens new venues of exploration and gains of insight.
Well, I think I can probably then say, first of all, Fraser, thanks for putting it all together. Anthony, I'm delighted it's been recorded, because it's been a very good event indeed. And that will be a way of keeping a particular record of it. Huge thanks to, obviously, Michael and Mark for quite substantive inputs. And then to our other four contributors, you know, Nicholas, Bethany and Fraser, for your contributions, and to the rest of us for chipping in, asking questions, bringing up reminiscences. And I've enjoyed it. So thank you to everybody very much.
Thank you for your leadership.
Well, very kind of you to say so. And I think that genuinely draws this evening to a conclusion. Keep well, everybody. See many of you soon. Bye.